It was the sword and shield of the Communist Party, a shadowy global organization that would strike fear into the West and the Soviet Union alike. The KGB, with a Russian-language name translating to the Committee for State Security, was one of the largest and most formidable intelligence organizations that the world has ever seen. Over nearly 4 decades of operation, the KGB would enter into direct competition with the American CIA and many parallel intelligence groups around the world, while harshly and often violently suppressing political and nationalist dissent in the Soviet Union. Even now, much of the KGB's work remains shrouded in secrecy decades after the agency was dissolved. What we do know paints a clear picture of an elite intelligence organization that was willing to do anything to protect its mother country, all the way up to the bitter end. In this installment of our Special Operators series, we're going to examine the intelligence agency known as the KGB, explore its mission, its modus operandi, tell the stories of some of its most famous or otherwise notable missions, and recount not just its bitter demise, but the modern-day organization that took its place. KGB's origins trace back to the Cheka, the Soviet Union's first secret police organization. Overseen by Felix Dzerzhinsky, who got an entry on the Biographics channel if you'd like to learn more about him. The Cheka was the organization responsible for setting up early labor camps, suppressing rebellions and mutinies after the rise of the Soviet Union, and otherwise constructing the architecture Vladimir Lenin believed was necessary to protect the interests of the Soviet Revolution. The Cheka was an extremely nasty organization known for its mass arrests, its liberal use of torture and summary execution, and its scorched earth repression of discontented peasants. And it was from this lovely legacy that the later guiding principles of the KGB would emerge. Over the next several decades, the Soviet Union's intelligence apparatus would proceed through a veritable alphabet soup of new and quickly discontinued secret police forces. The Cheka would give way to the GPU, aided by the INO, then the GPU became the OGPU, which became the NKVD, assisted by the GUGB and the NKGB, and then a different NKGB, and then the MGB, and then the MVD. Probably screwed some of those up. Now, we're obviously not going to dwell very long, or, well, really at all, on any of these prior organizations. Suffice to say, each iteration of the Soviet secret police would generally be defined by 3 major factors: an expansion or change in its mission, for example, due to the Second World War, or the new pressures that come from a more developed party apparatus, a series of important lessons learned and new operational capabilities they developed, and an ignominious ending that was typically part of a larger Soviet shake that came around every couple of years. After the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, the leader of what was then known as the NKVD, Lavrentiy Beria, formed a 3-way leadership agreement known as a Troika, which would oversee the country in the wake of Stalin's demise. Beria was a uniquely cruel character in his time, about what you'd expect from the last and most successful of Stalin's secret police chiefs, and he had gained a reputation for large-scale massacres in Poland, forced relocation of many minority populations from the Caucasus Mountains, and the expansion of Stalin's Gulag program. He also guided the integration of many Eastern European states into the Soviet Union, and oversaw the Union's efforts to successfully build the atomic bomb. Not only had Beria long been a centerpiece of the Soviet Union's greatest upheavals, but also one of its most deeply entrenched officials, and a pivot into Stalin's role as dictator really wouldn't have been too much of a surprise. But that all changed in June 1953, just months after Stalin's death, when Nikita Khrushchev overthrew the leading Troika and saw to it that Beria was executed. With his death, so died the Soviet state police as Beria had constructed it. Among Khrushchev's many steps to consolidate his power was a purge of Beria's high-level associates, including many within the state intelligence apparatus. Although this choice meant that Khrushchev's new secret police might lose out on their experience and expertise, it also provided an essential form of ideological culling that would allow the next organization to start fresh. And start fresh it did. When the KGB was established in 1954, it would take a leading role in the purge of Lavrentiy Beria's supporters, hunting down anybody who might pose a threat to Khrushchev's rule, while pulling any relevant players in the Soviet intelligence world into the new agency's orbit. From the start, the KGB was set up in a meaningfully different way than most of the Soviet Union's prior secret police organizations, as the party by now had learned the hard way that the secret police had a tendency to spiral their operations out of the party's control. This time, the KGB would operate in a way directly subordinate to party leaders, with a regimented military structure that positioned the Soviet state clearly at the top of that pyramid. At least from the outside, it would appear that this choice paid off. The KGB would persevere through the demise of the Soviet Union decades later, instead of simply being purged and restructured yet again when Khrushchev himself was deposed in 1964. When the KGB took the reins from the NKVD, it was subdivided shortly after into some 20-odd directorates, each responsible for various roles and responsibilities within the government. By the fall of the Soviet Union, the agency had grown into a highly robust, broad-scope organization with carefully constructed redundancies to guard against its own demise. Some of the most important directorates included the KGB's branches for external and international intelligence, counterintelligence within the Soviet Union, protection of high-level party officials, and the political police, who worked to suppress anti-Soviet or opposition political movements within the Soviet states. Other less impactful but unique directorates included large-scale units dedicated to cryptography, wiretapping, and surveillance of enclosed spaces, and units to combat organized crime. In many ways, the KGB was also a sort of coverall organization. Guards on the Soviet border were KGB agents. The institution had its own division of Spetsnaz special forces troops, and it was responsible for field reconnaissance to support military operations. Like any good spy agency, the KGB also had its own robust research and development department and a vast repository of internal archives. The KGB was also responsible for crucial measures to guard against the collapse of the Soviet state. Its 15th main directorate was built to oversee command and control structures that the government would use in the event of a major war, while the Close Protection Service fulfilled a function similar to that of the American Secret Service. The so-called Directorate Z existed first to censor artistic and intellectual dissent, and then to protect the Soviet Union's constitutional order, a mandate that superseded any one autocrat who might lead the Soviet state astray. The organization adopted a strict military hierarchy with clear standards of internal discipline and regulation, and a parallel rank structure to the Soviet armed forces. In many foreign services around the world, high-level personnel hold equivalent military ranks. For example, an American ambassador holds the same military authority as a 4-star general, and the KGB's operatives formed a similar structure, allowing easier cross-coordination between the KGB's border, signals, and special operations troops, and the broader Soviet command infrastructure. Since the Soviet Union was a federal state consisting of a large number of constituent republics, each republic had its own KGB, all subordinated to the chairman of the KGB. For example, the Moldovan KGB would oversee its own surveillance and repression operations in Moldova, while also carrying out any orders that came down from Moscow. A lot of the KGB's real punching power came from its operatives abroad, which were subdivided into two basic categories: the so-called legals and illegals. The legals were personnel headquartered in Soviet embassies and consulates, where in 1983 about a third of diplomatic employees were believed to be KGB employees undercover. They were referred to as legals due to their ability to operate within a host country under visas and diplomatic protections granted by those countries. Other legals would enter various countries as representatives of the Soviet press corps or international business interests, providing their support to the known operatives at work in Soviet diplomatic offices. The illegals, however, were what we would usually think of when imagining a Soviet spy operation. Agents with a false identity, fluency in the language spoken in their target nation, and a deeply reinforced personal history and backstory that would allow them to infiltrate far into the nation where they're stationed. Often these agents would go inactive for years before carrying out an intelligence operation, building lives overseas while awaiting orders. For what it's worth, many experts agree that the TV show The Americans is actually a reasonably accurate depiction of this sort of operation, albeit with a heavy dollop of Hollywood fantasy on top. So, if this topic is of interest to you, then we've got 75 episodes of content to recommend. For many of the illegals, intelligence gathering was as simple as getting information back to the Soviet Union if it was publicly available elsewhere, in order to help the Soviets see through the fog of war that came from a basic lack of cultural interactions with the West. In other scenarios, the illegals would gather far more sensitive or well-guarded intelligence and spirit it away to their handlers. Their cover identities would either be tailored directly to the needs and strengths of the individual spy, or on occasion there'd essentially be a body double for a real person who was in on the secret. This sort of human intelligence operation was the KGB's bread and butter overseas, where their agents learned to blend in better and better until they became almost seamless facades of an ordinary Western citizen. And just as important as sending personnel abroad was the ability of those personnel to recruit or compromise human assets, Westerners who either joined the KGB operations willfully or were coerced into doing so. One KGB defector estimated that in West Germany, some 1,500 citizens became Soviet spies in the early 1970s, and while actual numbers are unknown, it's abundantly clear that the KGB cultivated assets heavily from Western governments, businesses, and scientific institutions. Many of these assets were recruited out of genuine support to the Soviet cause, although various international anti-communist efforts like the American Red Scare blunted some people's willingness to join the cause. Others would be coerced into cooperation with blackmail, or via so-called honey trap operations, in which KGB agents would seduce a potential asset before leveraging that personal relationship into an intelligence one. More often, though, they'd simply pay off their assets, a technique that usually worked far better than Western organizations would have liked to believe. Within the Soviet Union, the KGB engaged in brutal political repression, gained a knack for shutting down opposition parties without rocking the boat enough to cause a full-scale rebellion most of the time. The KGB's internal doctrine was organized around identifying and punishing displays of so-called non-conformity. That is to say, the thing that got the KGB looking sideways at someone wasn't so much their affinity for one particular ideology or alternative political party, but their broader resistance to a series of Soviet norms. In addition to levering the Soviet Union's network of gulag camps, the KGB targeted religious minorities while keeping the Russian Orthodox Church firmly in its own pocket, and installed personnel in most major workplaces who would keep an eye out for anti-communist sentiment. Often, these operatives would work in staffing or security departments, but for many employees, they'd become the HR manager from hell, keeping close tabs on any potential whiff of subversive activity. In addition to domestic and international human intelligence collection, the KGB was deeply involved in the creation and proliferation of propaganda both at home and abroad, while working to spread disinformation around the world. The KGB also included strong signals intelligence and logistical support, and spent a great deal of resources cultivating and protecting the networks of informants and handlers that they placed around the world. Often, they'd be involved in infiltrating subversive or potentially damaging organizations, sowing dissent or guiding policy within these groups in order to keep them from becoming a problem. And there's one final dimension to the KGB that bears discussion: its direct action capabilities, which worked around the world to assassinate and kidnap targets, foment insurgencies, and supply or train revolutionaries in many of the third countries that would host the Cold War's endless proxy conflicts. Like the CIA's Special Activities Division, the KGB's direct action elements were widespread around the world, training commandos and insurgents in Cuba, Palestine, and elsewhere, and assisted Western European terrorist groups like the Irish Republican Army, the Italian Red Brigades, and the West German Baader-Meinhof gang, while distributing weapons and crucial intelligence to Marxist and other leftist revolt across the Third World. The KGB also moved massive amounts of money to organizations that it deemed favorable, not just revolutions, but anti-war or pro-communist groups around the world, many of which didn't even know the source of the funds that they were receiving. And finally, they were instrumental in laying the groundwork for the Soviet military's premeditated expeditions abroad from the 1950s through the 1980s, setting up intelligence and supply networks that would expedite military operations. The ranks of the KGB were filled in its early years by a network of state loyalists, the friends and relatives of powerful party members, some of the most effective and often brutal enforcers of the party's will from prior intelligence organizations and the military. But as the KGB began to develop its own unique flavor, it began to draw far heavier on the well-educated, free-thinking young intellectuals of Soviet universities, especially those with fluency in foreign languages. Enticed by higher pay and the prospect of getting the hell out of the worst parts of the Soviet Union, many of these students were more than happy to join up. The children of military, police, and border personnel were especially in demand, as were graduates of Moscow's Institute of International Relations, a veritable finishing school for future spies. Upon being selected for candidacy, young Soviet citizens would typically be invited for an interview in which KGB personnel could explain their role and mission. Candidates could then be screened for basic suitability. From there, candidates who passed a battery of secondary and qualifying tests would move on to officer training. Much of what we know on KGB training comes from a cache of training manuals translated by journalist Michael Weiss in the late 2010s. The manuals, technically classified in Russia even today, cover a wide range of subjects meant to train or coach potential Soviet intelligence officers, focusing on those working as handlers or spies abroad. Among the topics, the manuals discuss how to identify and psychologically manipulate Western sources and cultivate them into intelligence assets, how to identify and combat Western disinformation schemes working on Soviet soil, and how to engage in and win the precise chess matches played between Western intelligence agents with whom a KGB officer might cross paths. The documents provide detailed information on the KGB's understanding of how to gather human intelligence, including highly specific guides on how to exploit a target's fears and vices and coerce them into becoming compliant to an intelligence-gathering operation. Frankly, there's far too much within the textbooks to cover, even if we devoted an entire video just to their contents. But for our viewers who enjoy going down the rabbit hole on topics like this, well, we look forward to seeing you again after your deep dive. I'll still be here. What it's most important to understand here is that the KGB was really, really good at human intelligence work, and defectors from the KGB have long since confirmed that both the organization's doctrine and the individualized training of its operatives centered around this sort of training. Formerly classified Soviet papers indicate that KGB recruits were educated in so-called Chekist values, that is to say, devout loyalty to the Soviet system of government and the Communist Party and dedication to its defense against enemies, foreign and domestic. In addition to espousing these Chekist values and cultivating human assets, the KGB's intelligence officers were expected to be competent in covert operations, secure communications, cryptographics, and cultural competency in whichever nation around the world where they'd be stationed. In their decades of operation, the KGB would distinguish themselves with the successful infiltration of every major Western intelligence agency in the world, as well as their ability to place assets at the highest levels of government, military, and business in just about every country that they set their sights on. The rewards for this success included the collection of massive amounts of technical and scientific data, which would guide the Soviet Union development of modern technologies, as well as the state secrets of both allies and enemies on the international stage. Internally, they engaged in especially brutal repression, with an overall human cost that might have been as high as the tens of millions in affairs like the Hungarian Revolution and the Prague Spring. It's a common adage around intelligence agencies that the world only learns about covert operations if they go wrong. But while it's certainly probable that the world still doesn't know about some of the KGB's biggest intelligence coups, we do know of some truly spectacular successes by their international operatives. For example, KGB operatives were able to cultivate an asset within the American FBI, an agent named Robert Hansen, who spied for the Soviet Union and Russia for over 2 decades straight. Over that time, Hansen earned himself over $1 million by selling the KGB literally thousands of classified documents, including American weapons and counterintelligence programs, while also identifying double agents within the KGB that were actually working for the West. Although he was eventually caught and sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences for his role in the Cold War, Hansen and his KGB handlers had already perpetrated a catastrophic infiltration of the US government, revealing state secrets on a level unheard of in the intelligence world. Perhaps even worse than Hansen was Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who was compromised by the KGB and spent about a decade funneling intelligence to the Soviet Union and Russia beginning in the mid-1980s. Ames is believed to have compromised over 100 covert operations during that time and led to the deaths of at least 10 CIA agents and sources. And it wasn't just the KGB's assets that wreaked havoc in the Western world, but their spies as well. Perhaps the most famous of all was Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, who would be sent to the US USA in the late 1940s and set up a spy ring in New York City. In the following years, he would be an architect in setting up networks to smuggle American secrets to Russia. An East German man named Albert Dietrich, also known in the US as Jack Barsky, was sent to the United States and used as a courier while trying to work his way up in American society, an effort that was ultimately unsuccessful but gave him valuable insight which he later shared with the American public after a life spent in the United States, and the birth of his child in America led him to become disillusioned with the KGB's dedication to communism. As we've already described, the work of the KGB went far beyond just information gathering and included large-scale plans to disrupt Western society. Among the more major operations in the US was Operation Cedar, a 10-year operation to lay the groundwork for a severe, even catastrophic disruption of the United States' power infrastructure. This included a specific focus on targeting massive hydroelectric dams, oil refineries, and pipelines running from Canada into the US, as well as the port of New York, which would have been blown up. We feel pretty comfortable in telling you that these attacks were never carried out, although why precisely the plan failed is still unclear. A plan of similar scale was known as Operation Pandora, and it targeted racial divisions rather than power infrastructure within the US. Operation Pandora's objective was to exploit racial tensions between white supremacist organizations and black militant groups after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in an operation that would have jointly spread disinformation, incited violence from each group, and bombed a historically black university in New York to kick off a race war. This operation, too, was unsuccessful, but race relations in the United States remained a favorite pressure point of the KGB for several decades. Globally, the KGB had an appetite for subversion that ran far beyond the US. The KGB was integral in the Soviet Union's advance into Afghanistan, fomenting years of political upheaval and directly carrying out a coup with its own operators. In Latin America, operatives propped up friendly regimes like Fidel Castro in Cuba while bringing down pro-American governments and propping up Marxist popular revolution. And internally within the Soviet Union, the KGB was at the center of a long series of counter-revolutionary efforts in various Soviet republics, while simultaneously monitoring dissidents, targeting intellectuals and writers, and putting together show trials to either discredit members of the opposition or at other times terrify Soviet citizens into compliance. For an organization as powerful and expansive as the KGB, granted an almost sacred mission to guard the Soviet Union from its enemies, it's almost ironic that the forces that would ultimately destroy the KGB were the same ones it worked so hard to serve. In the Soviet Union, corruption and decay at high levels of government were unavoidable, in part because many of the same people perpetrating the corruption were the people tasked with investigating it. In this way, and perhaps only in this way, the Soviet Union might have been better served if the KGB had the sort of runaway authority that its prior intelligence services did, with the latitude to investigate and even bring down high-ranking party officials in the name of the Union. But with the KGB placed so intentionally subordinate to the party, it was powerless to take on the major instigators of the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. When Mikhail Gorbachev arose to the position of head of state in 1985, he came with a series of worldviews and priorities that often placed him at odds with even himself. Though Gorbachev was possessed of a deep understanding and even a respect of the KGB's work at home and abroad, he was ultimately more concerned overall with reforming the Soviet state and limiting the authority of many powerful groups, very much including the KGB. It was no accident that Directorate Z changed its mission in 1989 to focus on the preservation of the Soviet Union itself. Indeed, that was at the height of Gorbachev's reforms, when it became clear that Gorbachev's path offered a choice between a fundamentally different Soviet Union or a collapse of the state entirely. The KGB continued its work as best it could, collecting and acting on intelligence wherever possible, but by 1991, the end was nigh. Now, on this channel, we've covered the last-ditch coup attempt meant to rescue the crumbling state, so, check that out if you'd like to learn more. The chairman of the KGB at the time, Vladimir Krakow, was at the center of the coup, and when it failed, much of the KGB's authority went with it. First, its military and paramilitary units were shut down, then its role as a secret police force was sharply curtailed. When the Soviet Union fell, the KGB was a shadow of its former self, as utterly helpless in the face of change as any other piece of the former party elite. What was left fell under the command of President Boris Yeltsin of Russia. In the following years, Yeltsin would deconstruct the KGB that had once existed. Its domestic services would be rolled into a new organization that would eventually be referred to as the Federal Security Service, or FSB. Its international components would become the External Intelligence Service, known under its Russian language acronym as the SVR. It's the FSB that has become the KGB's spiritual successor, and it's not lost on anybody in Russia or around the world that under Vladimir Putin, a former KGB operative and FSB head himself, the modern FSB has continued to thrive. These days, the FSB operates both in Russia and around the world, fulfilling much of the same mandate that the KGB once did. Former leaders of the KGB now serve at high levels of the new organization, as well as in other ministerial and government posts across Russia. Unsurprisingly, none of the KGB's former leaders have been held accountable for their crimes which were perpetrated against citizens of the Soviet Union, nor their brutal legacy of state-sponsored repression of Soviet society writ large. Even as the official organization of the KGB has long since faded into history, it's the bones of the agency that still exist today. Its former leaders, its intelligence network around the world, and its tools to repress political opposition in Russia. In all honesty, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the KGB's gone through a simple cosmetic change, a rebranding for a post-Cold War world. And sure, there's plenty of people around the world who'd tell you that appraisal is wrong. But for our part, here on More Graphics, we'll just encourage you to make that assessment for yourself. The KGB is dead. Long live the KGB, or something to that effect.